Hello again, everyone. We are going to spend some time going through two bills. Our first one is our own Representative Anthony, who's going to take us through H39. It is on our committee page. Representative Anthony, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Colleagues, Peter Anthony, Barre City. This H39 is the second time this bill has been reintroduced. I believe the committee had at least a nodding acquaintance with it during last term. I was not on the committee during last biennium. If I may go back a little personal experience, I was attracted to this issue not only for reasons that you've heard about in the last 2 weeks in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of various tax strategies, income raising strategies, but years ago, my first introduction to municipal and public participation was as a member of the Revenue Sharing Committee of the City of Barre, compliments of President Jimmy Carter, who created a national revenue sharing regime in 1978, survived until the great communicator came in, and it expired, if you will, by Congressional Act in '82. So it was relatively short-lived. But it was fascinating to me because it energized and engaged people who ordinarily were not part of the government, if you will, establishment. They weren't councilors or select board members. They were citizens. And that was mandated, frankly, in the book, in the statute. In any case, as you undoubtedly know, those of you who both have been around and are new to Ways and Means, the local municipalities, jurisdictions in Vermont have a fairly short list and cramped, if you will, ability to raise revenue. It also not only is it confined to a short list of fees, property, maybe if you are involved in water, sewer, there are other kind of utilities that you participate in as a local jurisdiction. But every one of those methods is, if you will, hits some of the six attributes of a good tax system very imperfectly, as I think you can appreciate. And as a net result, I became, as Commissioner Bolio has said, you know, the state of Vermont is the most efficient and successful, and I think, how shall I say, covers most of the six characteristics of a high quality tax system of all jurisdictions and if you will, entities that are able to raise money in the state of Vermont. It's the state of Vermont that can do it most inexpensively and I think most satisfactorily given the six objectives of an ideal tax system. I always think about diversity, reliability, and fairness. Those are my three big ones. I had a side conversation with Emily Byrne last Friday at the end of her presentation, because I was a bit taken aback that in the category known as fairness, interestingly enough, and reliability, diversity is not noted in the fairness category. It is noted in the reliability category. I found, and if you, again, put another comment that we've heard together, each tax has its strength and weakness in respect to the six attributes. Some are more progressive, some are more fair, some are more reliable, transparent, non-shiftable, or do not affect, neutral, do not affect personal behavior. But no single tax, in essence, hits all the buttons. So we are always urged to look at a myriad of taxes and evaluate that basket of taxes in respect to the six categories, not one. Consequently, I think a way to help communities each of whom have advantages, many of whom have more advantages than other communities. That is to say, natural resources, commercial advantage, locational advantage is not evenly and equitably distributed throughout the state of Vermont. I think that's self-evident. So how do we help localities? Well, generally now it's categorical. We give them highway money, we give them stormwater money. It's very issue specific. There is almost no mechanism to help communities who do not have a natural advantage, in essence, chart a way for success for the next generation. Doesn't happen. I found that having a way to engage people, a wider group of people beyond the select board, in the kind of future planning for your community by volunteers, by members of the citizenry, in addition to voting, in addition to going to town meeting, is an extraordinarily important, if you will, gauge to future success of communities to survive. So I look upon revenue sharing not only as a way to accomplish specific things, but a way to engage a wider array of members of the community in charting the future of that community, despite disability, non-advantage, et cetera. And it doesn't cut, by the way, by rural versus urban. There's some of the older communities in Vermont, as you may know, have municipal tax rates going up close to $2. Okay? Other almost is negative. That is to say, they're swimming in the ability to raise money through the property tax. So there's an enormous, if you will, advantage gap, if you will. So for me, this is to bring life to half our motto called unity and engage people and try to even, if you will, the array of advantages that you find around the state that are there and historically rooted. So that's why I introduced it. I have a short list, obviously, in the bill of people to think about this. This is a working group bill. It's not a I have the magic wand bill. And so it's the beginning of a process from my point of view. There's nothing in this list that should be taken as definitive. But these are the groups of folks within the legislature who have, I think, a natural advantage in this discussion simply because they know about where revenue comes from whom, and they know about the 6 attributes of tax systems on both the other body and within the House. So that's my summary. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Did you give any consideration to doing this as a cost sharing working group instead of a revenue sharing working group?
I'll leave that to the working group.
Okay.
I have sort of a similar question. I've done some research this summer about sort of revenue sharing in various states, how Massachusetts, Minnesota has a really interesting model that they're updating. And that part seems easier to figure out than where the revenues come from that are shared. And I noticed that doesn't seem as explicit in your bill. So I wondered if you have thoughts on that.
You're right. And the problem with looking at it as a cost sharing exercise, as we learned in the past 10 days, there are fairly confined, if you will, opportunities to do sharing. It may be an assessment district, a water district, a fire district. They're very solid waste. They're very, very issue specific. And by the same token, generally speaking, geographically cramped.
Yeah.
So, Peter, I see that you're including a member of the VLCT. So when Katie Buckney was here the other day, she talked about their new one-stop shop to click on for all the help for the different projects.
I appreciate that. I just think ultimately it's a very political discussion. And I think they can be a resource, but in the end, it's the two bodies who have to decide how we would construct this, how we would give it life and give it, if you will, some sustainability and institutionalize it. My conversations with Executive Director Horn over the 4 years I've been around always run into a shrug of the shoulders because of the skepticism on the part of many people as to whether we could sustain this even if we created it. And that's a process, if you will, of institutionalizing this and considering it part of the unity, if you will, aspect of our ethic. If we can't institutionalize that, you're right, it will come and go.
Thanks. This is, I think, a really important conversation to have. And I think I hear you talking about some of the goals. I'm curious whether you thought about writing, and obviously it's just a short form, specific sort of intent language into like the problem that the group is trying to solve. Sort of, you're talking about like what are the different ways that we can raise and distribute resources. I think I'm hearing you say, and the goal is to ensure that all communities have access to resources to invest in infrastructure or improve the quality of life. Like, did you think about providing some guidance to the committee about what problem we're trying to solve?
I think first there has to be a commitment for there to be a working group. And then I would be the first person to say, I'd like to talk to you, working group, because I have some experience with this. And I live in a community that has had a heyday and has struggles.
Yeah, beyond the words on the page, there have been some discussions in Ways and Means in previous years about local option taxes. The discussion has often recognized that some communities have a great advantage when it comes to local option taxes and some teeny-weeny communities have not. And one of the things that Peter and I have discussed, and I think he will remember, is what do we do about that? And one of the ideas that Peter and I discussed previously was basically centered around aggregating local option tax money in a bucket and distributing it to communities that don't have an opportunity to do that sort of thing. And it's not on the printed page, but it is something that that I would certainly be interested in favoring, that sort of discussion if we got there. And this is on fairness, on applicability. And I know once upon a time I was on the League of Cities and Towns, and at that time there were members on the league board that would say, don't you dare touch my local option tax money. But this bill raises the question of how is this fair? And so, I go for the bill as the way it is now, or as we might amend it or something like that. But I think that as you point out, this is a discussion that needs to happen. And I think, and we are, many of us, aware of little teeny weeny communities that don't have an opportunity to raise revenue to do things that ought to be done.
Tiny but mighty.
Tiny but mighty.
Not teeny.
But anyway, so yeah, this is part of the discussion, I think. And my recollection is that at least in draft form, we discussed in last year's miscellaneous tax bill. I don't remember, it didn't get to the finish line. There was a discussion about this sort of stuff, about the local option tax.
House Bill
Take it back and
514.
give it out. But anyway, so
I think Representative Beck sponsored it.
Yeah, Janet and I's one, House Bill 514. It was
Yeah.
a short form bill, but we had
Yeah.
testimony.
But anyway, okay, so I'm ready to go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Representative Anthony,
Hey, I appreciate it. Thank you.
in a different chair. Representative Dolan. Thank you for joining us to talk about H44, which I believe is also about the local option tax. How exciting. Why don't we take a minute to all go around and introduce ourselves to you before we get started? Hi, I'm Emily Kornheiser. We already know each other.
Field?
Julia Andrews.
Captain Sims.
Jim Maslin.
Scott Beck.
Kurt Taylor?
Peter Anthony.
Carolyn Brannigan.
Carl Demmer. We're getting good at that.
We are.
Yeah.
Welcome. Floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'm Carrie Dolan. I'm one of the two representatives from Washington 2 District representing Duxbury, Facein, Moortown, Waitsfield, and Warren. And I thank you for this opportunity to talk about local option taxes. H4, perfect timing. So the purpose of this bill, and as you are aware, what a local option tax is that as described by the Vermont Department of Taxes, it's an alternative method to raise municipal revenues. It's set at 1%. It's in addition to existing business taxes, and the 1% can be applied to sales, meals, alcohol beverages, and/or rooms, as well as aviation fuel, jet fuel, but that's a small addition there. And it cannot apply to the sale or rental of motor vehicles. And there are many many cities and towns that have taken advantage of the local option tax to aid in their work to invest in town services that maintain the economic health and well-being of those cities and towns. And these cities and towns that have a local option tax tend to be our larger communities that have a larger population size. What this bill does is provide an added incentive to assist our smaller rural towns in using the local option tax to encourage them to invest in themselves, to invest in the economic vitality of their communities. So why now? This is the third time I've presented this bill. It's been different. My first attempt was a 90-10 split where 90% of the funds for our smaller communities could be retained for these smaller towns, and 10% would be offered after administrative costs to the state. That bill didn't go anywhere. Then I tried a 80-20. So this one is a 75-25 split. So it's my third attempt, but it's really to help our smaller communities that are struggling to find the resources they need to invest in themselves, to come up with the funds that they can leverage in the delivery of their town services. There's a growing wedge, as we can see, of the communities that are benefiting from the dollars that we have available. We are doing the right thing in asking whether there are underserved communities and targeting that for the next effort in terms of trying to equalize those funds. But there's still that wedge of communities that may not qualify for that underserved nature, are small in terms of population, but need the resources so that they can keep up. They can see a future that can support their housing, their infrastructure needs. And this is what this bill attempts to do. So in sum, the current statute that structures local option taxes is in a manner that it covers administrative costs, and the towns will receive right now 70% of the local option revenues collected within that town jurisdiction, and the remaining 30% goes to the state. And this, as I mentioned, the bill offers that incentive to smaller towns under a threshold of 2,400 in the population. Every time I talk to a different representative, they ask me to move it up a bit or move it a bit. So it's at 2,400. After covering administrative costs, those towns would receive 75%, and the remaining would be for 25%. And as I mentioned, that this bill is for municipal services such as infrastructure and housing, the infrastructure needs, for example, that can support that housing, and it's not for education expenditures. So if we were to take up this bill, obviously hearing from the League of Cities and Towns, town officials with local option taxes. We have larger cities and towns, Brattleboro, Williston, Winooski. We have medium-sized towns with this, Brandon, Killington, Woodstock, and Stowe. The Mad River Valley towns are very interested in this, and they just can't quite get there without this added incentive. So in my mind, I think this is a win-win type of bill. Why? It's a win for small towns. It's giving them the added revenue so that they can envision their future and invest into that future for that economic health and livability of their communities. It's a win for pilot, because what the state uses for this is that in lieu of fee revenues to support where we have state buildings, for example, helping those communities be whole, then this would add additional revenues for a pilot. And it's a win for the state, because as we empower our communities, we're able to maintain the livability of those communities, the attractiveness of these communities to be a continued, perhaps an attraction for new people coming to our state and the welcoming that we want to offer new residents coming to our state.
You mentioned, does anyone else have a question before I ask mine? You mentioned pilot. I'm curious if you've ever been able to take a look at sort of the percentage of properties that are exempt from taxation on the grand list in these larger communities versus the smaller communities that you identified.
A few years ago, when I first looked at it, I looked at that information. And I know there's always been a struggle in trying to have enough revenues that pilot supports to accommodate that need. But this generates additional revenues, but creates an incentive for our smaller communities to take part in that contribution to the state.
One of the things I've always found interesting about pilot is it covers, state properties, but not all of the other properties that are exempt from the grand list.
So it's state buildings, I believe.
Anyone else? Yeah.
It's a question, and you probably, I'm on the Connecticut River Valley, and I completely understand why communities steer away from this being sandwiched up against New Hampshire. But in Waitsfield, especially after Wayfair, why are these towns still leery of this, the existing local options tax?
There's a long history of the Mad River Valley communities, like all our communities, are fiercely independent, fiercely have their own personalities, and yet they do rely on each other. We see that especially when we tried to go through redistricting. Don't separate the Mad River Valley communities, but we still sort of, there's always that lovely tension there. So with respect to local option tax, you would think that many of for example, our ski valley towns or ski area towns have local option tax, but not our communities, for example. So why? Well, partly is because there's still that we still have working lands. We still have one community has wastewater, doesn't have water. Waitsfield being kind of the economic hub of the communities has water but not wastewater. It's still required. We share some services such as fire protection or at least emergency protection, but not fully all services. And so how would that look like with communities that in our valley where how you invest really has to be a regional perspective? We do have in place a Mad River Valley Planning District that gives us the opportunity to have the dialogue, but there's still the inertia of being able to overcome some of that, the communication needs and the planning we need to undertake to ensure that we're targeting these monies most wisely. A couple of years ago, when we were in the height of talking about local option tax, there were just different points of view between the commercial hub of Waitsfield and the other two communities in the valley, and some turf issues too. So it's like anything, a bit tension, and that's again why I think having that added incentive could potentially bring people together. Just last night, I had a night meeting bringing all the communities together, including Sugarbush, our largest employee, with our Mad River Valley Planning District to talk about our visioning. We even had Paul Costello participate, as well as Mr. Brady from the League of Cities and Towns. And local option tax was brought up again. And what I'm looking for is being able to offer an added incentive for our communities to work together for that common vision that may end up looking more regional, but can have that still support that flavor of that personality that we would want to embrace.
Representative Dolan, is it that extra 5% that you think will get the communities to buy in? Is that what you're?
Well, I was really hoping for that 90-10. Some of the when I was on the select board, we were hoping for a larger share of those dollars because we had a larger share of need. We have a substantial need to be looking at some of the infrastructure needs that we know we need to be able to become vibrant. We know we need wastewater. We know we need some other infrastructure in our downtown areas that support regionally the region of the Mad River Valley. So we were honestly hoping for a greater incentive. And since I couldn't get any much attraction, I'm willing to have that conversation about where that line is. I'm open for a more, but I'm willing to accept some added incentive to be just that kind of, just enough to be able to get us over and other smaller communities over the finish line there.
Rep. Taylor, then Rep. Sims, but we only have 5 minutes left because how much time we have left.
Is that the reason they haven't done it? Is because of that split? What makes you think that would turn them around?
Well, we're a very fiscally conservative community as well as the rest of the valleys. And we want to make sure that we're successful. It's kind of those performance outcomes that we want. And there was still not enough of there was a lukewarm feeling of whether the original plans for a local option tax was actually going to help us achieve the outcomes we knew we need to achieve. And having that added incentive will bring people to the table, put a plan together, show success and build on that success and demonstrate the outcomes. So when you look at, who will be benefiting from this? Smaller communities with their vision and being able to then demonstrate their successes with real projects that add to the economic vitality of those communities.
Thank you.
Just a question about sort of eligibility, adding this 2,500 threshold. Do you have a sense of how 2,400 people, though, right?
2,400 people, yeah.
How many more municipalities might be eligible? And
I started looking at that. I have a spreadsheet, of course, looking at the populations. And, Vermont is made up of many, many smaller communities, certainly well below the 2,400. And that's where that threshold is. But I was really, even though it is true, it's in the relationship with the rest of the size communities in the state, and maybe there would be a concern that captures too many of the majority of Vermont communities, but why not? Because we would be adding to the state coffers with that 25%, but we would enabling those smaller communities, even if it's a larger share of overall communities, we're still enabling them to help themselves and invest in their own future.
well, so sorry, just to follow up against then why have any town size threshold?
I didn't quite tell you.
Given the argument that I hear you making, don't we want all communities to be able to access revenue to do what they need to? Why have a population threshold at all?
We don't have a population threshold. We've reached a plateau where, again, our larger communities are taking advantage of this and reinvesting in themselves. And we're seeing that. And we're also seeing the wedge of the type of investment or access to dollars or leveraging those dollars that are causing a differential between those communities that are larger and being able to access and leverage those dollars and those that aren't being able to have available to them added revenues to invest in themselves.
I appreciate that, Representative Dolan. I believe one of the local option taxes we approved last year was for a teeny town, and I don't remember which town it was. I don't know if any of the other. Yeah.
Montgomery is a small town.
But thank you very much for spending this time with us. Really appreciate it. Sorry to be up against the deadline. We have our tax workshop at noon that we're all really looking forward to.
Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you.
And I'm going to go off live with buttons.
So I guess